Have you ever found yourself in a moment of complete despair, where no solution seemed enough to heal your pain? Have you ever felt like your problems were too big, too tangled, and beyond any human help? In those moments, when the weight of life feels unbearable, a question often emerges deep in our hearts. Is there a force, a presence, a divine intervention that can truly change everything? The answer is not only yes, it's a resounding promise written in the life and acts of one extraordinary person, Jesus Christ. Throughout his time on earth, Jesus performed 37 recorded miracles, each one a beacon of divine wisdom, power, and unfailing love. These weren't just isolated acts of compassion, they were life-changing moments that carried profound lessons for every soul who witnessed them and for every heart that reads about them today. Whether it was restoring sight to the blind, calming raging storms, or even raising the dead, each miracle reveals a side of Jesus that speaks directly to our deepest fears, struggles, and hopes. But let me ask you, have you ever thought about how these 37 miracles aren't just stories from the past, but keys that can unlock breakthroughs in your life today? Every act, every word, every miracle holds a lesson, a promise, and a touch of divine power ready to meet you where you are. Whether you are battling illness, financial hardship, emotional wounds, or spiritual emptiness, these miracles aren't distant events. They are living testimonies of what God can still do in your life right now. Today, we're about to embark on a journey through these extraordinary acts, and I want to invite you to actively be a part of this experience. Write in the comments, Jesus still works miracles. This isn't just a comment, it's a declaration of faith, a bold step towards inviting divine intervention into your situation. And remember, every time you engage, you're helping this message of hope reach someone else who desperately needs it. By the end of this video, you'll not only understand these miracles, but you'll also know how to apply their wisdom and power to your own challenges. You'll discover practical tools to strengthen your faith, find hope in the darkest moments, and experience the transformative love of Jesus in your daily life. So, don't just watch. Stay with me until the end, because every second of this journey holds something that could shift your perspective, heal your wounds, and renew your spirit. And now, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's incredible to see how this message unites hearts across cities and nations through the unchanging power of Jesus. Prepare yourself, because we're about to dive into the first of the 37 miracles, a moment of divine power that could very well be the key to your breakthrough today. First miracle, Jesus turns water into wine. It was a day of celebration, a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Laughter filled the air, music played, and families gathered to witness a moment of joy. But behind the smiles and the flowing wine, a silent crisis began to unfold. The wine had run out, an unthinkable embarrassment for the hosts. Have you ever felt that way? In the middle of a moment that should be joyful, something suddenly goes wrong. A failure, a lack, an emptiness. When our human resources dry up, our solutions seem small, and we feel the weight of helplessness. But while everyone saw a limit, Jesus saw an opportunity. In the midst of the commotion, Mary approached her son, her voice steady yet filled with unshakable faith. They have no more wine. And Jesus, though his time had not yet come, acted because of her faith. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, large and empty, waiting. "Fill the jars with water," he said. The servants obeyed, confused yet trusting his words. Moments later, the master of the banquet tasted what had been poured from those jars. His eyes widened with astonishment. "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, but you have saved the best till now." In that instant, ordinary water became extraordinary wine. A miracle, a sign, a glimpse of divine abundance and grace. But let me ask you, how often do we look at the empty jars in our lives, our failed plans, our unmet needs, and think it's too late? How often do we forget that Jesus is still capable of turning our nothing into everything? Just like at that wedding, he doesn't just provide, He provides abundantly and with excellence. There's a modern story of a man who lost everything: his job, his family, his sense of purpose. In the moment of surrender, he prayed, "Jesus, take my emptiness and fill it with your purpose." Slowly, like water turning into wine, his life began to change. He found a new job, restored broken relationships, and discovered peace where there was once only chaos. His jars, once empty, overflowed with blessings. The lesson is clear. When you invite Jesus into your situation, he doesn't just fix what's broken. He transforms it into something far better than you could have imagined. Write in the comments, "Jesus transforms my life." What empty jar in your life do you need him to fill today? And as we move forward, prepare your heart. In the next miracle, we'll see how faith, even when stretched across distance and uncertainty, can bring healing to the impossible. Stay with me. Your breakthrough might just be one word away. Next miracle. The healing of the royal official's son. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dusty roads of Cana. A desperate man approached Jesus, his face marked by exhaustion and fear. He was a royal official, a man of status and influence, yet in that moment none of his power or wealth could help him. His son was dying, and every breath the boy took was a painful reminder of how fragile life truly is. Have you ever been in a place where nothing you had, no money, no connections, no knowledge, could solve the problem in front of you? That's where this man was, standing face to face with Jesus, clinging to a thin thread of hope. "Sir, come down before my child dies," he pleaded, his voice trembling. But Jesus didn't rush to follow him home. Instead, he spoke words that carried an authority no earthly power could match. "Go, your son will live." In that moment, the man had a choice. Would he trust the word of Jesus and walk away without physical proof, or would he stay and beg for more? With a deep breath and faith born from sheer desperation, he turned and began his journey home. The road back must have felt endless. Every step was a battle between doubt and hope, but then servants came running to meet him. "Your son is alive," they shouted. At that exact moment when Jesus had spoken, the fever had left the boy. The miracle had happened, not through touch, not through proximity, but through faith in the spoken word of Christ. This story teaches us something profound. Sometimes, Jesus doesn't change our situation instantly. Instead, he speaks a promise, and we're called to walk in faith even before we see the outcome. How many times do we ask for a miracle, but hesitate to trust the words he has already spoken over our lives? There's a quiet strength in trusting without seeing, in walking forward even when the evidence hasn't yet arrived. The official believed, and his son was healed. In the next miracle, we'll see how a single encounter with Jesus can drive out the darkest forces tormenting a soul. Stay with me. There's more to discover, and every miracle carries a light meant to guide your path. Next miracle, Jesus heals a man possessed by an evil spirit. The synagogue was filled with people. Men, women, and children gathered to hear Jesus teach. His words carried a weight unlike any other, cutting through the noise of daily life and piercing the hearts of those who listened. But among the crowd, there was one man whose presence disrupted the stillness. His eyes were wild, his voice sharp with torment as he cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Can you imagine the scene? A sacred space, a moment of peace shattered by a voice filled with chaos and fear. How often do we too find our peace disrupted, not by visible chains, but by invisible ones? Fear, anxiety, addiction, anger, chains that grip the soul and refuse to let go. But Jesus didn't flinch. He didn't recoil in fear or uncertainty. With a calm authority that silenced every other sound in the room, he spoke just a few words. "Be quiet. Come out of him." In an instant, the man convulsed, and with a final cry, the spirit left him. Silence fell over the synagogue once more, but it wasn't an ordinary silence. It was a holy stillness. The people stared in awe. What is this? A new teaching, and with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him. This miracle isn't just about physical possession. It's a reflection of how Jesus confronts the chaos within us. There are moments in life when we feel captive to something we can't explain. A habit, a thought pattern, a wound from the past. But Jesus doesn't avoid our chaos. He steps right into it and speaks peace over our storm. Freedom isn't found in avoiding the struggle or suppressing the darkness. It's found in bringing those struggles to Jesus and letting his authority speak over them. When he says, "Be quiet, come out," every tormenting voice must flee. In the next miracle, we'll witness how even the smallest act of faith can set off a chain reaction of healing and restoration. Stay with me, there's more light ahead, and every step brings us closer to the heart of God's power. Next miracle. Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. The house was small, filled with the scent of bread baking and faint murmurs of conversation. But in one of the rooms, the air was heavy with sickness. Peter's mother-in-law lay in bed, her face flushed with fever, her body weak and trembling. Outside, Peter walked back and forth, his heart weighed down with worry. Have you ever felt that helplessness, the kind where someone you love is suffering, and there's nothing you can do to ease their pain? When Jesus entered the house, he didn't hesitate. He walked straight to her bedside. There were no grand gestures, no lengthy prayers. He simply reached out his hand, touched her, and helped her up. In that instant, the fever left her. Her strength returned so completely that she didn't just sit up, she began to serve them. It's a simple scene, almost quiet compared to other miracles, but there's something deeply personal about it. Jesus didn't just heal her sickness, he restored her purpose. She went from being bedridden and helpless to serving others with strength and joy. How often do we find ourselves paralyzed, not just by physical ailments, but by emotional or spiritual fevers? Anxiety, bitterness, disappointment, they keep us lying down when we were meant to stand and serve. But Jesus doesn't just see the sickness. He sees the purpose beyond the sickness. This miracle is a reminder that healing isn't just about removing pain, it's about restoring us to our calling, to our place in the world. Jesus doesn't just want us well, he wants us whole, ready to live out our purpose with renewed strength. In the next miracle, we'll witness how Jesus steps into the ordinary moments of life and transforms them into extraordinary encounters. Stay with me. Another powerful act of divine love awaits. Next miracle, the miraculous catch of fish. The dawn was breaking over the Sea of Galilee, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. The water was still, reflecting the quiet beauty of the morning. But on one of the boats, silence was not peaceful, it was heavy with frustration. Peter and his fellow fishermen had spent the entire night casting their nets, only to pull them back empty every single time. Have you ever worked tirelessly, poured your heart and energy into something, only to see nothing come of it? That sense of exhaustion, disappointment, and quiet defeat, that was what Peter carried as he cleaned his nets on the shore. But then Jesus stepped into his boat. With a calm voice, he told Peter to push out into deep water and let down the nets again. Peter hesitated. "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." And with that simple act of obedience, Peter cast his nets one more time. What happened next defied logic. The nets began to fill, fish after fish, so many that the weight threatened to tear them apart. They signaled for another boat to help, and even then, both boats began to sink under the sheer abundance of the catch. Peter fell to his knees before Jesus, overwhelmed by the miracle, by the realization of who stood before him. "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." But Jesus didn't turn away. Instead, he spoke a calling over Peter's life. "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." This miracle isn't just about fish or full nets. It's about trust, obedience, and purpose. How often do we give up because our efforts seem fruitless? How often do we refuse to cast our nets one more time because we're too tired, too skeptical, or too afraid of failing again? But when Jesus enters our boat, when we allow him to direct our steps, what once seemed empty becomes overflowing. This miracle reminds us that with Jesus, our greatest failures can become the foundation for our greatest calling. He doesn't just fill our nets, he fills our lives with purpose and abundance. In the next miracle, we'll see how a single touch from Jesus can restore not just a body, but also a soul weighed down by isolation and shame. Stay with me. There's more to uncover, and every miracle brings us closer to the heart of divine love. Next miracle. Jesus heals a man with leprosy. The air was thick with dust as a lone figure approached the outskirts of the village. People scattered at the sight of him, shielding their faces, whispering curses under their breath. His skin was scarred, his body covered in the unmistakable marks of leprosy. For years he had been an outcast, untouchable, unwanted, unseen. Have you ever felt that way? Isolated not by walls, but by the invisible barriers of shame, guilt, or rejection. But this man had heard of Jesus. He had heard of miracles, of healings, of a love that crossed boundaries others refused to even approach. And so, trembling, he fell at Jesus' feet. "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." There was no demand in his voice, no entitlement, just raw vulnerability, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, Jesus would see him differently. And Jesus did. He didn't recoil in disgust. He didn't step back or send the man away. Instead, he reached out his hand and touched him. Can you imagine the weight of that moment? For years, no one had touched this man. And yet, in one simple gesture, Jesus broke through the barriers of fear and rejection. "I am willing," Jesus said. "Be clean." Immediately, the leprosy left him. His skin was restored, his scars vanished. But this miracle wasn't just about physical healing, it was about restoration. Jesus not only healed his body, but he also restored his dignity, his place in society, and his ability to live freely again. How many of us carry invisible leprosy, the kind that isn't seen on the skin, but weighs heavy on the soul? Fear, regret, bitterness, they isolate us, keeping us from connection, from joy, from life itself. But Jesus isn't afraid of our scars. He isn't repelled by our brokenness. He reaches out and touches the places we think are untouchable, and with his love, he makes us whole. In the next miracle, we'll witness the power of faith expressed not by words, but through unwavering trust in the authority of Jesus. Stay with me. There's more healing, more light, and more life to uncover. Next miracle, Jesus heals the centurion's servant. The sun was high in the sky as the crowd pressed closer to Jesus. In the midst of the commotion, a Roman centurion, a man of authority and power, stepped forward. But this wasn't an ordinary request from a man used to giving orders and receiving respect. His voice trembled slightly. His face carried the weight of concern. "Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." Think about this moment. A Roman officer, part of an occupying force, humbly approaching a Jewish teacher for help. It wasn't just an act of desperation. It was an act of deep faith. Have you ever been in a situation where all your influence, knowledge, and resources couldn't fix what was broken? Where the only thing left to do was to surrender and trust? Jesus' response was immediate. "Shall I come and heal him?" But the centurion stopped him. "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed." Just say the word. The centurion understood something profound: authority. He knew that true power doesn't always require proximity, it requires command. He recognized in Jesus an authority that went beyond the physical world, an authority that could cross space, illness, and human limitations. Jesus marveled at him. "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith." And at that very moment, without Jesus setting foot in the centurion's home, the servant was healed. This miracle isn't just about physical healing. It's about understanding and trusting the authority of Jesus. How often do we tie our faith to visible results, to proximity, to what we can see and feel? But real faith trusts even when the evidence isn't immediately visible. Real faith says, "Just say the word, Lord, and I know it will be done." The centurion's faith reminds us that Jesus' authority is not bound by time, space, or circumstance. His word carries power, power to heal, power to restore, power to transform. In the next miracle, we'll witness how forgiveness and healing are intertwined, and how Jesus doesn't just address the surface of our problems, but reaches into the deepest parts of our soul. Stay with me. Another moment of divine power is about to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus heals a paralyzed man in Capernaum. The house was overflowing with people. Every corner, every window, every doorway was packed with men, women, and children, straining to hear Jesus speak. Outside, 4 men carried their friend, a man paralyzed, trapped in a body that refused to move. Have you ever felt stuck? Not just physically, but emotionally or spiritually, paralyzed by fear, guilt, or failure? That man on the stretcher wasn't just unable to walk. He was trapped in a life of dependence, isolation, and hopelessness. But his friends refused to let the crowd stop them. Driven by love and unshakable faith, they climbed onto the roof, tore open a hole, and lowered their friend down, right in front of Jesus. Can you imagine the scene? Dust falling, light streaming through the opening, the silent gasp of the crowd as the paralyzed man was gently lowered into the presence of the healer. Jesus looked at him, not just at his broken body, but at his weary soul. And then, instead of immediately addressing the physical problem, Jesus said something unexpected. "Son, your sins are forgiven." The religious leaders were shocked, offended even. "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" they murmured. But Jesus, knowing their thoughts, asked, "Which is easier to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat, and walk'?" And then, with divine authority, Jesus turned back to the man and said, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." Instantly, strength returned to his limbs. He stood, picked up his mat, and walked out in full view of everyone. The crowd was astonished, praising God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." This miracle reveals something profound. Jesus doesn't just heal symptoms, he heals the root of the problem. Sometimes, the brokenness we see on the outside is only a reflection of a deeper wound on the inside. And while we may come to Jesus asking for physical relief, he often begins with our hearts, offering forgiveness, restoration, and peace. This story reminds us that no obstacle, no crowd, no barrier, no sin is too great to keep us from Jesus when we approach him with faith. He sees us. He knows our deepest needs, and he speaks healing into every corner of our lives. In the next miracle, we'll witness how even a withered hand can become a symbol of restoration and purpose in the hands of the Savior. Stay with me. Another act of divine love and wisdom is waiting to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus heals a man with a withered hand. It was the Sabbath, and the synagogue was filled with people. Some had come to worship, others to listen. But a few were there with a different intention, to watch Jesus closely and see if he would dare to heal on a day reserved for rest. Among them stood a man with a withered hand, a hand that had long been useless, shriveled, and lifeless. Have you ever felt like a part of you, your dreams, your talents, your purpose, had withered away, left useless by disappointment, failure, or time? The man stood in silence, perhaps trying to make himself smaller, to avoid drawing attention. But Jesus saw him. He didn't overlook him or pretend not to notice. Instead, he called him to the front. "Stand up in front of everyone." Imagine the tension in the air. The man might have felt exposed, vulnerable, every eye in the room locked on his brokenness. But Jesus wasn't setting him up for shame. He was setting him up for healing. Jesus then turned to the onlookers, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" Silence filled the room. No one dared to answer, but Jesus didn't need their approval. He turned back to the man and said, "Stretch out your hand." It was a simple command, but one heavy with faith. How do you stretch out something that no longer works? How do you act on a command that feels impossible? But the man obeyed. He stretched out his hand, and in an instant, it was restored, whole, strong, alive again. This miracle isn't just about physical healing, it's about obedience and faith in the face of impossibility. Jesus didn't touch the man's hand. He didn't speak a long prayer over him. He simply gave a command, and the man responded in faith. How often do we hold back our brokenness, our weaknesses, afraid to stretch them out before God? Yet, it's in the act of obedience, in the willingness to expose what's withered, that healing begins. This story reminds us that Jesus sees the parts of us that we've hidden away, the areas we've deemed unusable or unredeemable. And with one command, he invites us to stretch them out before him, to trust and to believe that restoration is possible. In the next miracle, we'll witness how even death itself cannot stand in the presence of the one who is life. Stay with me. There's a moment of divine resurrection ahead, and it carries a message of hope like no other. Next miracle, Jesus raises the widow's son in Nain. The dusty road leading out of Nain was filled with mourners. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the small crowd. At the center of it all was a widow, her face etched with grief. Her only son, the last connection to her past, her provider, her hope for the future, lay lifeless on a wooden bier carried by others. Have you ever felt that kind of loss? The kind where something or someone you depended on is suddenly gone, leaving behind silence and emptiness. This wasn't just the death of a son. It was the death of security, stability, and belonging. In that time, a widow without a son was vulnerable, unprotected, and left to the margins of society. But as the funeral procession moved forward, another crowd approached from the opposite direction. At the front of this second group was Jesus. When he saw the widow, he didn't just notice her tears, he felt her sorrow. Scripture says his heart went out to her. He stepped forward, breaking every social and ceremonial rule. "Don't cry," he said gently. Then he walked to the bier, placed his hand on it, and the bearers stopped in stunned silence. "Young man, I say to you, get up!" The command cut through the stillness like lightning. Breath returned to the lifeless body. The young man sat up and began to speak. And then, in one of the most tender moments recorded in the Gospels, Jesus gave him back to his mother. This miracle wasn't performed because someone asked Jesus for it. The widow didn't beg. The crowd didn't plead. It happened because Jesus saw her. He felt her pain, and he acted. How often do we walk through life carrying grief, loss, or a sense of finality, believing that hope is buried and gone? But Jesus specializes in interrupting funerals, interrupting moments where we've declared something as over, finished, beyond repair. This miracle teaches us that with Jesus, even the dead places in our lives, dreams, relationships, faith, can come back to life. Nothing is truly lost when placed in his hands. In the next miracle, we'll step into a raging storm and witness how the voice of Jesus can calm even the most violent winds and waves. Stay with me. Peace is about to speak into chaos, and it's a moment you won't forget. Next miracle. Jesus calms the storm. The night had fallen heavy over the Sea of Galilee. The sky was cloaked in darkness, and the wind began to howl, whipping the waters into towering waves. In a small wooden boat, the disciples struggled against the fury of the storm. Water poured in over the sides, their arms ached from rowing, and their voices cracked with fear. Have you ever been in a storm like that? Not just one with wind and rain, but a storm in your life, when everything feels out of control and no effort seems enough to keep you afloat. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, Jesus was asleep. As the storm raged and the disciples panicked, Jesus lay resting, unshaken by the turmoil around him. Finally, in their desperation, they woke him. "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Their words were filled with fear, but also with a glimmer of hope, because deep down they knew that if anyone could save them, it was him. Jesus stood up. The wind screamed, the waves crashed, and the boat pitched violently under his feet. But with a calm voice, he said, "Quiet, be still." In an instant, the wind stopped. The sea became calm, as smooth as glass. The chaos gave way to silence. Then he turned to his disciples and asked, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Their fear of the storm was replaced by awe. Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. This miracle isn't just about a storm at sea. It's about the storms within us. How often do we let fear take control, forgetting that Jesus is in our boat? Fear doesn't mean we lack faith, but it does reveal where we've placed our trust. The disciples had the Savior of the world with them, yet their focus was on the storm, not on him. But here's the truth: storms will come, the waves will rise, the winds will howl. But if Jesus is with us, peace isn't dependent on calm waters. It's found in trusting the one who can command the storm to be still. In the next miracle, we'll encounter a man tormented by forces no one could control until he met Jesus. Stay with me. Freedom is about to break through in a way that changes everything. Next miracle, Jesus heals the demon-possessed man in the region of the Gadarenes. The sun was just beginning to rise over the hills of the Gadarenes, casting faint light over a barren, rocky landscape. In the shadows of the tombs, a man moved, wild, broken and tormented. His hair was matted, his body covered in scars and chains that had long been broken. He roamed among the graves, screaming into the wind, utterly consumed by forces no one could understand, let alone control. Have you ever felt bound by something invisible? Fear, addiction, shame that keeps you trapped, no matter how hard you fight to break free? When Jesus stepped ashore, the man saw him from a distance and ran to him. But the words that came from his mouth weren't his own. "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Don't torture me." The voices that had tormented him for so long trembled in the presence of the one who carried absolute authority. "Come out of this man, you impure spirit," Jesus commanded. And in that moment, the power that had held this man captive began to crumble. The spirits begged to be sent into a herd of pigs nearby. And at Jesus' word, they left the man and entered the animals, which then rushed down a steep bank into the lake and drowned. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time in what might have been years, the man was still. He was free. When the people from the nearby village arrived, they found him sitting calmly at Jesus' feet, clothed and in his right mind. The transformation was undeniable. But instead of celebrating, fear gripped the hearts of those who witnessed it. They asked Jesus to leave their region, unable to comprehend the power they had just seen. But the man who had been healed begged to go with Jesus. Instead, Jesus told him, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." This miracle isn't just about demonic oppression. It's about liberation. It's about how Jesus steps into the darkest, most broken corners of our lives and brings light, peace, and freedom. There are forces in our lives, addictions, fears, wounds that we cannot overcome on our own. But in the presence of Jesus, no chain is too strong, no darkness too deep, and no soul too far gone. In the next miracle, we'll see how one simple touch, filled with faith, can stop Jesus in his tracks and bring healing that no doctor could ever offer. Stay with me. The next act of divine love is waiting to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus heals a woman with an issue of blood. The streets were crowded, the air thick with dust and anticipation. Jesus was walking through the city, surrounded by people pressing in on every side. In the midst of this chaos, a woman moved quietly, almost invisibly. For 12 long years, she had suffered from a relentless hemorrhage. 12 years of pain, shame, and isolation. She had spent all her money on doctors, endured countless treatments, and yet her condition had only worsened. Have you ever felt that way? Exhausted from trying everything, hoping for answers, only to be met with disappointment? But that day, she heard Jesus was passing by, and somewhere deep within her weary soul, a fragile spark of hope flickered to life. If I just touch his cloak, I will be healed. It wasn't a grand gesture, nor a bold confrontation. It was a quiet, trembling faith. She pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding with every step. Finally, she reached out and her fingers brushed the edge of his robe. In an instant, everything changed. The bleeding stopped. Her body felt whole, alive, restored. But then, Jesus stopped. He turned and asked, "Who touched me?" The disciples, bewildered, pointed out the crowd pressing against him from all sides. But Jesus knew. This wasn't an ordinary touch, it was a touch of faith. The woman, trembling, fell at his feet and confessed everything. She might have expected rebuke or embarrassment, but instead, Jesus looked at her with compassion and said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." This miracle isn't just about physical healing. It's about the courage to reach out to Jesus, even when everything seems hopeless. It's about believing that a single moment in his presence can change everything. How many times do we let fear, shame, or the noise of the crowd keep us from reaching out to him? This woman reminds us that faith doesn't always have to be loud or dramatic. It can be as simple as a trembling hand reaching out in trust. And Jesus, in his love and power, always responds to faith. In the next miracle, we'll witness how Jesus doesn't just stop at healing. He brings life back to what seems completely lost. Stay with me. A miracle of resurrection is about to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. The house was silent, filled with the heavy stillness of grief. Outside, mourners wept loudly, their cries echoing through the narrow streets. Inside, Jairus, a respected synagogue leader, stood beside the lifeless body of his 12-year-old daughter. Just hours before, he had fallen at Jesus' feet, begging him to come. "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." But before they could reach her, the message came, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Have you ever been in a moment like that? When hope feels extinguished, when the words, "Why bother?" ring loud in your mind. But Jesus looked Jairus in the eyes and said something extraordinary. "Don't be afraid, just believe." When they arrived at the house, the crowd of mourners laughed at Jesus when he said, "The child is not dead, but asleep." But Jesus ignored the scorn. He entered the room with Jairus, the girl's mother, and a few of his disciples. The room was heavy with sorrow, the child lying still, her small hands folded by her side. Jesus walked to her bedside, took her cold hand in his, and spoke two simple words. "Talitha cum," little girl, I say to you, get up. In an instant, her eyes opened. Breath filled her lungs. She sat up and began to walk around the room. Can you imagine the look on Jairus' face? The tears of disbelief turning into tears of overwhelming joy. This wasn't just a healing, it was a resurrection, a reversal of what seemed final and unchangeable. This miracle isn't just about bringing a dead girl back to life. It's about the authority of Jesus over the finality of death. It's about his ability to step into our most hopeless moments and speak life where everyone else sees only an ending. How often do we stop believing because the situation looks too far gone, too broken, too lifeless? But with Jesus, death isn't the end. What seems final to us is simply an opportunity for him to demonstrate his power. In the next miracle, we'll see how two blind men, guided only by faith, discovered a light that no darkness could extinguish. Stay with me. The next act of divine compassion is waiting to be revealed. Next miracle, Jesus heals two blind men. The narrow streets were crowded as Jesus walked through, his presence drawing people like a magnet. Among the noise and movement, Two blind men sat by the roadside, their world wrapped in darkness, but their ears worked perfectly, and they had heard stories of a teacher who could heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, and even raise the dead. Hope stirred in their hearts, and when they sensed Jesus passing by, they cried out with all their strength, "Son of David, have mercy on us!" The crowd tried to silence them, dismissing their cries as an inconvenience, but they wouldn't stop. "Son of David, have mercy on us!" Have you ever felt that kind of desperation? The kind that refuses to be silenced by rejection, by the crowd, or even by your own doubts? Jesus stopped. The crowd grew quiet. He turned to them and asked a question that pierced through the noise. "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" Without hesitation, they answered, "Yes, Lord." Jesus touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." In an instant, light flooded their world. The men blinked, gasping as they saw colors, faces, and the loving gaze of Jesus for the very first time. This miracle isn't just about restoring physical sight, it's about the power of persistent faith. These two men didn't let their circumstances, their limitations, or the crowd's discouragement stop them. They had no physical sight, but their spiritual vision was clear. They knew Jesus could heal them. How often do we let the noise of the crowd, the doubts, the fear, the discouraging voices keep us from crying out to Jesus? How often do we allow hesitation to cloud our faith? This story reminds us that faith doesn't always start with what we see. It begins with what we believe. Jesus asked them if they believed, and their unwavering "Yes, Lord" became the key to their miracle. In the next miracle, we'll witness how Jesus confronts not just physical affliction, but also spiritual bondage as he restores speech to a man silenced by darkness. Stay with me. Another moment of divine breakthrough awaits. Next miracle, Jesus heals a mute man possessed by a demon. The marketplace buzzed with life, merchants shouting, children laughing, and animals bleating. Yet in the midst of all the noise, one man stood in silence. His lips moved, but no words came out. His eyes carried a story of torment, isolation, and helplessness. This wasn't just physical muteness. It was spiritual captivity. Something dark had bound his voice, chaining his ability to express himself, to cry out, to connect. Have you ever felt silenced? Not just in words, but in spirit. Have you ever felt like something deep inside you is locked away, unable to break free? They brought him to Jesus. Perhaps friends or family guided him, hope flickering in their hearts that this teacher, this miracle worker, could do something no one else could. Jesus looked at the man, not just at his silence, but at the invisible chains that held him captive. With divine authority, Jesus commanded the demon to leave. In an instant, the man's body convulsed slightly, his face relaxed, and then a sound, a voice. Words tumbled from his mouth, perhaps shaky at first, but then stronger, clearer. The crowd froze in astonishment as the man began to speak. Conversations halted, eyes widened, and whispers rippled through the onlookers. Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel, but not everyone celebrated. Some Pharisees muttered in anger and disbelief, accusing Jesus of driving out demons by the power of darkness. Yet the evidence stood undeniable. A man who had been silenced was now speaking freely, joyfully, and fully restored. This miracle isn't just about speech. It's about liberation. It's about how Jesus doesn't just address symptoms. He goes straight to the root of the problem. When darkness binds us, whether it's fear, addiction, shame, or doubt, Jesus doesn't negotiate with it. He commands it to leave. How often do we remain silent, trapped by invisible chains we've grown used to? But this story reminds us that no force, spiritual or otherwise, can withstand the authority of Jesus. He doesn't just restore our voice, he restores our ability to live freely, to express ourselves, to worship, to love, and to connect. In the next miracle, we'll witness a man lying by a pool, waiting for a miracle he thought would come from the water, but instead, it came from a voice. Stay with me. A life-changing encounter is about to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus heals a paralyzed man at the pool of Bethesda. The pool of Bethesda shimmered under the midday sun, its waters still and deceptively peaceful. Around it, a crowd of broken bodies lay scattered, blind, lame, paralyzed, each one clinging to a fragile thread of hope. They waited for a miracle, for the moment the waters would stir, believing that the first to enter would be healed. Among them was a man who had been lying there for 38 long years, 38 years of waiting, hoping, and watching others receive what he longed for. Have you ever felt like that? Stuck in a cycle of waiting, watching others move forward while you remain paralyzed, emotionally, spiritually, or physically? Jesus entered that scene of desperation and approached this man directly. He looked at him, not with pity, but with profound compassion, and asked a question that cut straight to the heart. Do you want to get well? It might seem like an obvious question, but sometimes our familiarity with our suffering makes us afraid of change. The man didn't answer with a yes or no. Instead, he explained his problem. I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. But Jesus wasn't limited by the man's circumstances. He wasn't waiting for the water to stir. With divine authority, he said, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At that moment, strength surged into the man's limbs. His frail, atrophied muscles came to life, and he stood up. For the first time in 38 years, he picked up his mat and walked. The crowd must have stared in disbelief as the man walked away, mat in hand, his steps steady and strong. But this miracle wasn't just about physical healing. It was about breaking cycles of hopelessness and paralysis. The man had been waiting for the right conditions, the right moment, or someone to help him. But Jesus showed him that healing doesn't depend on perfect circumstances. It depends on His word, His power, and our willingness to respond. How often do we wait by our own pools of Bethesda, convinced that our breakthrough can only come in one specific way? But Jesus bypasses the limits we've set in our minds. When He speaks, everything changes. In the next miracle, we'll witness how 5 loaves and 2 fish placed in the hands of Jesus became more than enough to satisfy thousands. Stay with me. A miracle of provision and abundance is about to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus feeds 5,000. The sun hung low on the horizon as shadows stretched across the grassy hillside. A crowd of over 5,000 people, men, women, and children, sat scattered across the landscape. They had followed Jesus for hours, hanging on His every word, their hearts filled with hope, but now their stomachs were empty. The disciples looked at the sea of faces and felt the weight of an impossible problem pressing down on them. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat, they said to Jesus. But Jesus replied with words that must have stunned them. You give them something to eat. Can you imagine their confusion? They looked at the small basket before them, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. How could such a small offering meet such a massive need? Have you ever felt that way? Faced with a need so great and resources so small that you were tempted to give up before even trying? But Jesus didn't see lack. He saw opportunity. He took the loaves and fish, looked up to heaven, gave thanks, and broke them. Then He handed the food to the disciples and told them to distribute it to the crowd. Basket after basket, handful after handful, the food kept coming. The loaves didn't run out. The fish didn't run out. Every person in that crowd ate until they were satisfied. And when it was over, the disciples collected 12 baskets full of leftovers. This miracle wasn't just about feeding hungry people. It was about revealing God's abundance in the face of human limitation. It's a reminder that when we place what little we have into the hands of Jesus, it becomes more than enough. Our time, our talents, our resources, when surrendered to Him, can be multiplied in ways we could never imagine. How often do we hold back because we think what we have isn't enough? But Jesus isn't limited by our scarcity. He isn't intimidated by big problems or small resources. When we trust Him with what we have, miracles happen. In the next miracle, we'll witness Jesus walking on water. a moment that reveals his authority not just over nature, but also over the storms that rage within us. Stay with me. A miracle of divine presence is about to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus walks on water. The night was thick with darkness, and the wind howled across the surface of the Sea of Galilee. The disciples were in a small boat, their faces tense with fear as the waves crashed against them, threatening to pull them under. They were alone, or so they thought. Have you ever felt that way? Struggling against the storms of life, rowing with all your strength, yet feeling as if you're battling the chaos alone? Then, out of the gloom, they saw a figure approaching, walking on the water. Fear gripped their hearts. "It's a ghost," they cried, their voices trembling with terror. But then they heard a familiar voice cut through the wind. "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Peter, always bold, called out, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said just one word, "Come." With trembling hands and a heart pounding in his chest, Peter stepped out of the boat. One foot met the water, then the other, and incredibly, he was standing, walking, moving across the surface of the stormy sea toward Jesus. But then the wind roared, the waves rose, and Peter's eyes shifted from Jesus to the storm. In that moment, fear replaced faith, and he began to sink. "Lord, save me," he cried. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" Together, they climbed into the boat, and the wind stopped. The sea grew calm, and the disciples fell to their knees in awe. "Truly you are the Son of God," they whispered. This miracle isn't just about defying the laws of nature. It's about trust in the middle of the storm. How often do we step out in faith, only to be distracted by the waves around us? Fear has a way of pulling our focus away from Jesus, but even in our doubt, his hand is ready to catch us the moment we call out to him. This story reminds us that courage doesn't come from the absence of storms, but from the presence of Jesus in the middle of them. The safest place to be isn't always in the boat, it's wherever Jesus is. In the next miracle, we'll see how even the briefest encounter with Jesus can bring healing to countless lives. Stay with me. Another powerful moment of divine compassion awaits. Next miracle, Jesus heals many in Gennesaret. The boat touched the shore at Gennesaret, and almost immediately, word spread like wildfire. Jesus is here. People ran from every corner of the region, carrying their sick on mats, calling out to neighbors, and rushing to see the teacher who could heal with just a touch. Can you picture it? Mothers clutching their children, fathers carrying loved ones, friends supporting the weak, all with eyes full of hope and hearts pounding with anticipation. Have you ever felt that kind of urgency? That desperate longing to bring your deepest need before Jesus, believing he can make all things right? The crowd pressed in around him. They didn't demand long prayers or grand gestures. They didn't ask for Jesus to visit every home or lay hands on every person. Instead, they begged for something simple. Let them just touch the edge of his cloak, and one by one, as trembling hands reached out, healing flowed. The blind opened their eyes to the sky. The lame stood and walked. The sick felt strength return to their bodies. Everywhere Jesus went, lives were being restored. This scene wasn't chaotic, it was sacred. Each touch carried a story, a burden, and a silent cry for mercy. But in every touch, there was also faith. Faith that even the slightest connection to Jesus was enough to change everything. This miracle isn't about a single act of healing, it's about the abundance of Jesus' compassion and power. He didn't turn anyone away. He didn't run out of grace. He met every need, no matter how big or small, with the same love and authority. How often do we overcomplicate our faith? How often do we feel like we need the perfect words, the perfect moment, or the perfect behavior to approach Jesus? But this crowd in Gennesaret teaches us something profound. Sometimes all we need to do is reach out. In the next miracle, we'll witness how a mother's relentless faith crossed cultural barriers and touched the heart of Jesus, bringing healing where others saw impossibility. Stay with me. A story of bold faith is about to unfold. Next miracle. Jesus heals the daughter of a Canaanite woman. The sun hung low as Jesus walked along the borders of Tyre and Sidon, a region far from the familiar crowds of Galilee. In this foreign land, a woman appeared, her voice cutting through the dusty stillness. "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession." Her words carried both desperation and boldness. Have you ever faced a moment where every door seemed closed, yet something deep within pushed you to keep knocking, keep asking, keep believing? At first, Jesus was silent. The disciples, uncomfortable with her persistent cries, urged him to send her away. But she wasn't easily dismissed. She knelt before him and said again, "Lord, help me." Jesus spoke, his words testing the depths of her faith. "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." To many, those words would have been an end, a rejection, but not for her. With humility and unwavering determination, she replied, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." In that moment, heaven and earth seemed to pause. Jesus looked at her and said, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And at that very hour, her daughter was healed. This miracle wasn't just about physical healing. It was about relentless, unyielding faith. It was about a mother who refused to give up, even when the answer seemed delayed, even when the cultural barriers and silence seemed impossible to overcome. How often do we stop praying, stop believing, stop hoping when our answers don't come immediately? How often do we let delays feel like denials? But this woman teaches us something extraordinary. Faith doesn't shrink back, it presses forward. Faith doesn't stop at the first closed door, it keeps knocking. This story reminds us that Jesus sees persistence. He honors faith that refuses to let go, even in the face of silence or obstacles. In the next miracle, we'll see how one man, trapped in a world of silence and isolation, experienced the tender touch of Jesus and heard sound for the very first time. Stay with me. Another moment of divine compassion and healing awaits. Next miracle. Jesus heals a deaf and mute man. The crowd brought the man to Jesus with cautious urgency. His eyes darted nervously, his lips moved without sound, and his hands gestured in frustration. He was deaf and mute, trapped in a world of silence and isolation. Have you ever felt like your voice didn't matter? Like no one could hear you, or worse, no one wanted to? The people pleaded with Jesus to place his hands on the man, but instead of performing the miracle in front of the crowd, Jesus took him aside, away from the noise and the curious stares. This wasn't going to be a spectacle, it was going to be personal. Jesus looked at the man, and in an act of profound intimacy, he placed his fingers into the man's ears and touched his tongue with saliva. Then, looking up to heaven, Jesus let out a deep sigh and spoke a single word, "Ephphatha," be opened. In an instant, the man's ears were opened and his tongue was loosened. Sound flooded his senses, the wind rustling the trees, the murmur of the crowd, the gentle voice of Jesus. And then, for the first time, he spoke. His words were clear, his voice steady. The crowd was astonished. "He has done everything well," they said. "He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." This miracle isn't just about physical hearing and speech. It's about connection and restoration. Jesus didn't just heal the man's ears and tongue. He restored his ability to communicate, to be understood, to belong. How often do we feel isolated in our struggles, unheard and unseen? But this story reminds us that Jesus meets us personally, away from the noise, away from the crowd. He speaks directly into our silence and commands, "Be opened," to healing, to connection, to life in all its fullness. In the next miracle, we'll see how Jesus, once again faced with thousands of hungry people, reveals God's limitless provision. Stay with me. A miracle of abundance is about to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus feeds 4,000. The sun blazed high over the hills as a massive crowd gathered around Jesus. They had been with him for 3 days, listening, watching, hoping, and now hunger gnawed at their stomachs. The disciples looked at the sea of faces, their brows furrowed with worry. Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? Have you ever faced a problem so overwhelming, so beyond your capacity, that you felt paralyzed by its enormity? Jesus, calm and unshaken, asked a simple question. How many loaves do you have? The disciples counted. 7 loaves and a few small fish. It was barely enough for a family meal, let alone thousands of people. Yet, Jesus didn't see scarcity. He saw opportunity. He took the loaves and fish, gave thanks, broke them, and handed them to the disciples to distribute. Basket by basket, handful by handful, the food multiplied. The crowd ate, not just tiny portions, but until they were fully satisfied. And when the meal was over, the disciples collected 7 large baskets of leftovers. This miracle wasn't just about feeding empty stomachs. It was about showing the disciples and us that God's provision isn't limited by what we see in our hands. It's about trust. It's about bringing the little we have to Jesus and watching him do something extraordinary with it. How often do we let our lack define our faith? How often do we hesitate to offer what little we have because we think it's not enough? But in the hands of Jesus, not enough becomes more than enough. This story isn't just about bread and fish. It's about surrender, trust, and abundance. Jesus doesn't just meet our needs, he exceeds them. In the next miracle, we'll see how sight is restored in stages, teaching us that sometimes healing and faith unfold step by step. Stay with me. Another moment of divine power is about to be revealed. Next miracle, Jesus heals a blind man in Bethsaida. The dusty streets of Bethsaida were alive with murmurs as a blind man was led to Jesus by the hands of his friends. They pleaded earnestly, "Please, just touch him." The man's world was shrouded in darkness, every step dependent on someone else's guidance. Have you ever felt like that? Lost, unable to see the way forward, relying on others to guide you through the uncertainty. But Jesus didn't heal him immediately. Instead, he took the man by the hand and led him outside the village, away from the noise, away from the stares, away from the crowd. This wasn't going to be a public display. It was going to be personal. Then, in a moment of tender intimacy, Jesus spit on the man's eyes and placed his hands over them. "Do you see anything?" he asked. The man blinked, his vision still blurry. "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Jesus wasn't finished. He placed his hands on the man's eyes again, and this time, clarity flooded in. The man's vision was fully restored. He could see everything clearly, every face, every leaf, every detail. This miracle stands out because it happened in stages. It wasn't instantaneous, but gradual. And isn't that so often the case with us? Sometimes God's work in our lives doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes healing, clarity, and breakthrough come step by step. How often do we grow impatient in the middle of our process, assuming God isn't moving because we can't see the full picture yet? But this story reminds us that Jesus doesn't leave us halfway. If the vision is still blurry, if the breakthrough still feels incomplete, he's not done yet. This miracle teaches us to trust Jesus, not just for the beginning of our healing, but for the completion of it. His timing is perfect, and his process is purposeful. In the next miracle, we'll witness how the relentless plea of a father brought healing to a boy, tormented by forces beyond his control. Stay with me. Another powerful act of divine intervention is about to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus heals a boy, possessed by an evil spirit. The air was thick with tension as a desperate father knelt before Jesus. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." Have you ever felt that kind of desperation? Watching someone you love suffer while every attempt to help seems to fall short. Jesus looked at the crowd and sighed deeply. You unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." And as they brought the child forward, the spirit within him convulsed violently, throwing the boy to the ground. The father's voice cracked as he said, "But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," Jesus replied, "everything is possible for one who believes." Tears welled up in the father's eyes as he cried out words that echo in so many hearts today. "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." With authority, Jesus commanded the spirit, "You deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The boy convulsed one last time, then lay still, so still that some thought he was dead. But Jesus reached down, took him by the hand, and lifted him to his feet. The boy opened his eyes, steady and clear. He was free. This miracle isn't just about a physical or spiritual healing. It's about the tension between faith and doubt. The father didn't have perfect faith, but he had honest faith, and Jesus honored it. How often do we find ourselves in that same place, believing yet wrestling with doubts that creep in when the situation looks hopeless? But this story reminds us that faith isn't about having all the answers or eliminating every doubt. It's about bringing our fragile belief to Jesus and saying, "Help me overcome my unbelief." This miracle teaches us that even imperfect faith, when placed in the hands of Jesus, can move mountains. In the next miracle, we'll see how a simple fish carried a divine provision, reminding us that God's care extends to every detail of our lives. Stay with me. Another extraordinary act of God's provision is about to unfold. Next miracle, the miracle of the coin in the fish's mouth. The sun cast golden reflections on the waters of the Sea of Galilee as Peter walked back toward Jesus, his steps heavy with concern. The temple tax collectors had approached him earlier with a question, "Does your teacher pay the temple tax?" It was a small amount, but Peter didn't have it, and neither did Jesus. Have you ever faced a moment like that? A need, a bill, or an obligation staring you in the face, and your resources simply weren't enough? When Peter entered the house, Jesus, already knowing what had happened, spoke first. "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others?" Peter answered, "From others." And Jesus said, "Then the children are exempt. But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4-drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." Can you imagine Peter's thoughts as he walked to the water, rod in hand? How unlikely, how absurd the instruction must have seemed. Yet Peter obeyed. He cast his line into the sea, and moments later he pulled up a fish. With trembling fingers he opened its mouth, and there it was. A coin, exactly enough to pay the tax for both of them. This miracle isn't just about money, it's about trust in God's provision. Jesus could have provided the coin in countless ways, but he chose a method that required obedience, faith, and action. Sometimes God's provision comes in ways we least expect, through an unexpected opportunity, a conversation, or even a fish's mouth. How often do we stress over our lack, forgetting that God already knows our needs and has prepared a way to meet them? This story reminds us that God is both aware of our smallest concerns and capable of extraordinary solutions. Jesus didn't just care about Peter's financial need. He cared about the lesson Peter would carry from that moment, the lesson that God is faithful even in the details. In the next miracle, we'll witness a man born blind, encountering Jesus and discovering a light he had never seen before. Stay with me. Another profound act of healing and revelation awaits. Next miracle, Jesus heals a man born blind. The streets of Jerusalem bustled with life as people went about their day, unaware of the man sitting by the roadside. He was blind from birth, his world painted in darkness. He had never seen the sky, the faces of his parents, or even his own reflection. Day after day, he sat in the same spot, begging, surviving. Have you ever felt trapped in a situation you had no control over, born into circumstances that felt impossible to change? As Jesus and his disciples walked by, a question was asked. "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" But Jesus' answer shifted their perspective entirely. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Then, in an act both profound and unexpected, Jesus spat on the ground, made mud with his saliva, and spread it over the man's eyes. "Go," he said, "wash in the pool of Siloam." The man rose, his heart pounding, his steps guided by faith and hope. He reached the pool, knelt by the water, and washed the mud from his eyes. For the first time in his life, light poured in. Colors exploded. Faces became clear. He blinked, overwhelmed, taking in a world he had only imagined. Can you picture his joy? The sheer wonder of seeing light for the very first time. But not everyone celebrated. The religious leaders questioned him, interrogated him, and even accused Jesus of wrongdoing because he had healed on the Sabbath. Yet, the man stood firm, his voice steady. "One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." This miracle isn't just about physical sight. It's about spiritual sight. It's about how Jesus brings clarity to the areas of our lives where we've been stumbling in darkness. How often do we live with spiritual blindness, unable to see the truth right in front of us because we're too caught up in tradition, fear, or doubt? The man's healing was not just a physical miracle, it was an invitation to a deeper revelation of who Jesus truly is, the light of the world. In the next miracle, we'll witness Jesus breaking through the weight of 18 years of suffering, showing that no affliction lasts forever in the presence of his healing power. Stay with me. Another moment of divine restoration awaits. Next miracle. Jesus heals a woman crippled for 18 years. The synagogue was quiet as the scrolls were unrolled and the teachings began. Among those gathered was a woman, her body bent over, her face close to the ground, unable to straighten herself. For 18 long years, she had carried this burden, her back twisted, her movements slow and painful. She lived as a shadow of herself, seen only in passing, unnoticed in the crowd. Have you ever felt like the weight of life has bent you over, making it impossible to stand tall or see beyond the struggle? Jesus saw her. While others may have looked past her, he noticed. He stopped teaching, called her forward, and spoke words that must have sounded like a dream. "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he placed his hands on her, and immediately her back straightened. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, she stood tall, her eyes lifted toward the heavens. Tears of joy spilled down her face as she began praising God. The weight she had carried for so long was gone. Not just the physical burden, but the emotional and spiritual heaviness that had defined her life. But not everyone rejoiced. The synagogue leader, clinging to rules and tradition, objected. "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." Yet Jesus, with calm authority, responded, "You hypocrites! Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day?" His words silenced the critics, and the crowd was filled with wonder and joy. This miracle isn't just about physical healing. It's about breaking free from the things that have bound us for far too long. Sometimes the weight we carry isn't just on our bodies. It's in our hearts, our minds, and our souls. But Jesus sees us, even when the world doesn't. He calls us forward, speaks freedom over our lives, and lifts our eyes to see his glory. How often do we let years of struggle convince us that change is impossible? This story reminds us that no matter how long we've been bent under the weight of affliction, Jesus can restore us in a moment. In the next miracle, we'll witness how Jesus turns a dinner gathering into an opportunity to confront pride and extend healing, proving once again that his love knows no boundaries. Stay with me. A powerful act of grace and compassion is about to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus heals a man with dropsy. The setting was a dinner table in the home of a prominent Pharisee. The room buzzed with conversation, filled with guests watching Jesus closely, not out of admiration, but out of suspicion. Among them was a man suffering from dropsy, his body swollen with fluid, a condition visible to all. He wasn't there by accident. He had likely been placed there as a test, a trap to see if Jesus would break the Sabbath rules once again. Jesus looked around the room, his gaze piercing through the pretenses. He asked a simple but profound question. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? The room fell silent. No one dared to answer. Then, without hesitation, Jesus turned to the man, touched him, and healed him completely. The swelling vanished, his body restored. The man stood there, whole and free. As the man left, the tension in the room grew thick. Jesus turned to the Pharisees and continued, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" Again, silence. They couldn't argue with his wisdom or deny the miracle they had just witnessed. This miracle wasn't just about healing the man's body, it was a declaration of what God's kingdom is truly about. The Pharisees had turned the Sabbath into a rigid rule book, but Jesus revealed its true purpose: restoration, compassion, and life. How often do we let traditions, expectations, or the fear of judgment keep us from receiving or extending grace? This story reminds us that Jesus isn't limited by human rules or opinions. He sees the need, he feels the pain, and he acts with love and authority. This miracle also teaches us to examine our own hearts. Are we more concerned with appearances and rituals, or with the restoration and healing of those around us? In the next miracle, we'll see Jesus confront death itself as he raises a beloved friend from the grave. Stay with me. An act of resurrection is about to reveal the depth of his power and love. Next miracle, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. The road to Bethany was filled with grief. Word had reached Jesus days earlier, "Lord, the one you love is sick." But instead of rushing to Lazarus' side, Jesus stayed where he was. And now, as he approached the village, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, were crushed by sorrow, their hope buried with their brother. Have you ever felt like God delayed when you needed him most? Like the window for a miracle had closed and all that remained was heartbreak? When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she ran to meet him, her voice trembling with pain. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus responded with words that carried a promise: "Your brother will rise again." Moments later, Mary came to Jesus, falling at his feet in tears. Her grief moved him deeply, and he wept alongside her. But this wasn't the end of the story. Jesus asked to be taken to the tomb. Standing before the sealed stone, he commanded, "Take away the stone." Martha hesitated. "Lord, by now there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Jesus replied with unwavering authority, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" The stone was rolled away, and Jesus looked up to heaven, praying aloud so all could hear, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe you sent me." Then with a voice that carried the power of life itself, he called out, "Lazarus, come out!" The crowd held its breath as a figure appeared at the entrance of the tomb. Lazarus, alive, still wrapped in burial clothes. Jesus commanded, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." This miracle isn't just about bringing a man back to life. It's about hope in the face of impossibility. It's about the truth that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Even when situations look utterly hopeless, he has the power to call forth life from the grave. How often do we bury our faith, convinced it's too late for God to intervene? This story reminds us that with Jesus, it's never too late. His timing is perfect, his power unmatched, and his love unshakable. In the next miracle, we'll witness Jesus healing 10 outcasts and teaching us a lesson about gratitude and faith. Stay with me. Another act of compassion is about to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus restores sight to blind Bartimaeus. The dusty road leading out of Jericho was crowded, alive with the sound of footsteps and conversation. Jesus was passing through, and the crowd pressed in around him, eager to see this teacher, this miracle worker. On the roadside sat a man, blind and begging, Bartimaeus. He couldn't see the commotion, but he could hear it. The murmurs, the excitement, and then the name that sparked hope deep within him, Jesus of Nazareth. Bartimaeus began to shout, his voice rising above the crowd, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The people around him tried to silence him, telling him to be quiet, to stop making a scene. But Bartimaeus wouldn't be silenced. He cried out even louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped. The crowd fell silent as he turned and said, "Call him." Bartimaeus threw off his cloak, his only possession, and sprang to his feet. He stumbled toward Jesus, guided by nothing but his determination and faith. When he stood before Jesus, the teacher asked him a question. "What do you want me to do for you?" Without hesitation, Bartimaeus answered, "Rabbi, I want to see." Jesus looked at him with compassion and said, "Go, your faith has healed you." Instantly, Bartimaeus' world changed. Light flooded his eyes, colors and shapes came into focus, and he saw the face of the one who had restored him. Overwhelmed with joy, Bartimaeus didn't simply go on his way. He followed Jesus, praising God with every step. This miracle isn't just about restoring physical sight, it's about the persistence of faith. Bartimaeus didn't let the crowd's discouragement stop him. He refused to stay silent, and his boldness brought him face to face with Jesus. How often do we let the noise of the world, the doubts of others, or our own insecurities keep us from crying out to God? Bartimaeus teaches us that faith isn't passive, it's active, persistent, and unyielding. In the next miracle, we'll see Jesus demonstrate his authority over creation as he speaks life into a barren fig tree, revealing a profound lesson about faith and fruitfulness. Stay with me. Another moment of divine insight is about to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus curses the fig tree. It was early in the morning as Jesus and his disciples left Bethany, the sun just beginning to rise over the hills. Along the road, Jesus noticed a fig tree in the distance, its leaves lush and green, a promising sight for someone who was hungry. But as he approached, he found no fruit, only leaves. The tree gave the appearance of life, but held no substance, no nourishment. Jesus spoke to the tree, his voice steady but firm. "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." The disciples heard his words, but didn't fully understand their significance. The next morning, as they passed the same spot, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter, astonished, exclaimed, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." This miracle wasn't about anger or hunger. It was a living parable, a lesson about fruitfulness and faith. The fig tree symbolized more than a plant. It represented lives and systems that appear full of promise on the outside, but bear no real fruit. Jesus used the moment to teach his disciples, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go, throw yourself into the sea,' and does not doubt in their heart but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them." This miracle challenges us to examine our own lives. Are we producing fruit, or are we merely displaying the appearance of faith without the substance? True faith isn't just about outward appearances. It's about a life that bears fruit in alignment with God's purpose. It also reminds us of the power of faith and prayer. When we trust fully in God and align our desires with His will, we can move mountains, overcome obstacles, and live a life that brings real impact. In the next miracle, we'll witness how Jesus, even in the face of betrayal and arrest, extended healing to an enemy, showing that His love knows no boundaries. Stay with me. A moment of divine mercy is about to unfold. Next miracle, Jesus heals the ear of Malchus. The night was heavy with tension as Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, his closest disciples struggling to stay awake nearby. Suddenly, the stillness shattered. A crowd, armed with swords and clubs, led by Judas, approached to arrest Jesus. In the chaos, Peter drew his sword, striking the high priest's servant Malchus and cutting off his ear. The scene was explosive. Fear, anger, and confusion rippled through the garden. Malchus stumbled back, clutching his bleeding ear, the pain radiating through him. Have you ever acted out of fear or desperation, only to realize later that your actions caused more harm than good? Peter's impulsive act could have escalated the violence, but Jesus stepped in with calm authority. "No more of this," Jesus said, his voice firm but filled with grace. Then, in an extraordinary moment, he reached out and touched Malchus's ear. Instantly it was healed, whole, as if nothing had happened. In the midst of betrayal, injustice, and impending suffering, Jesus chose mercy. He didn't just heal Malchus's ear, he diffused the tension and showed that his kingdom is not one of violence, but of love and restoration. This miracle isn't just about physical healing, it's about the radical love of Jesus, even toward those who opposed him. Malchus was part of the group sent to arrest him, yet Jesus extended grace without hesitation. How often do we withhold compassion from those we consider enemies? This story reminds us that Jesus' love knows no boundaries. He calls us to extend grace, even when it's undeserved, even when it's uncomfortable. As Jesus healed Malchus, he demonstrated that his mission was not about fighting with swords, but about transforming hearts. His power wasn't just to defend himself, but to bring peace in the midst of conflict. In the next miracle, we'll witness the greatest act of divine power as Jesus conquers death itself, showing that no force, not even the grave, can overcome him. Stay with me. The ultimate moment of victory is about to unfold. Next miracle, the resurrection of Jesus. It was early in the morning and the world seemed cloaked in darkness, both literal and spiritual. Jesus, the one who healed the sick, raised the dead, and calmed the storm, had been crucified. His lifeless body had been laid in a borrowed tomb, sealed with a heavy stone and guarded by Roman soldiers. For his followers, hope felt as though it had died with him. Have you ever felt that way? Like the light had gone out in your life and all that remained was silence and despair? But then, on the third day, something extraordinary happened. The earth shook, the stone was rolled away, and the guards fell like dead men. Inside the tomb, there was no lifeless body, only grave clothes left behind as a witness to the impossible. Mary Magdalene and the other women came to the tomb early that morning, their hearts heavy with grief. But instead of finding Jesus' body, they were met by an angel who said, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay." Moments later, as Mary wept near the tomb, a voice called her name. "Mary!" She turned and saw Jesus standing before her, alive. Her sorrow turned to joy, her despair into worship. "Rabboni!" she cried, her heart overwhelmed with the realization that death had not defeated him. This miracle isn't just about Jesus rising from the dead. It's about the victory of life over death, light over darkness, and hope over despair. The resurrection is the cornerstone of faith, the ultimate proof of God's power and love. How often do we face situations that feel final, like all hope is lost? The resurrection reminds us that with Jesus, the story is never over. He specializes in bringing life where there was only death, hope where there was only despair. Because he lives, we can face tomorrow. Because he conquered the grave, we can walk in freedom, knowing that nothing, not even death, can separate us from his love. In the next miracle, we'll see how Jesus' victory extended to his disciples, filling their nets with abundance and reminding them of their calling. Stay with me. Another act of divine provision is about to unfold. Next miracle, the miraculous catch of fish. After the resurrection, the Sea of Galilee stretched wide under the morning light, its waters calm and reflective. 7 disciples sat in a boat, their nets dragging through the water. It had been a long night of fishing, but not a single fish had been caught. The weight of their failure hung heavy, echoing their uncertainty about the future. Have you ever felt that way? Pouring your effort into something only to see no results, unsure of what comes next. As dawn broke, a figure appeared on the shore. The man called out, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" They replied, "No." The stranger then said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." Exhausted but willing, they cast their nets one more time. Immediately the water churned with life. Fish swarmed the net, so many that they could barely haul it into the boat. In that moment, recognition sparked in John's heart. "It is the Lord," he exclaimed. Peter, ever impulsive, jumped into the water and swam to shore, desperate to reach Jesus. When the rest of the disciples arrived, dragging the net behind them, they found Jesus waiting. A fire burned on the shore with fish and bread already prepared. "Come and have breakfast," he said, inviting them to sit and eat. This miracle wasn't just about fish. It was a reminder of who Jesus is and what he had called them to do. Just as he had filled their nets 3 years earlier, he was showing them again that with him, their efforts would never be in vain. How often do we feel like giving up, thinking our work is fruitless? This story reminds us that when we listen to Jesus' voice, even the most ordinary efforts can yield extraordinary results. His provision goes beyond our expectations, meeting not only our physical needs, but also our deeper need for purpose and connection. After breakfast, Jesus turned to Peter and asked 3 times, "Do you love me?" Each time Peter answered, Jesus gave him a command: "Feed my sheep." This was more than a meal. It was a restoration, a reminder of the mission they were called to fulfill. In the final miracle, we'll witness how Jesus ascended to heaven, leaving his disciples with a promise and a purpose that continues to shape the world. Stay with me. The conclusion of this miraculous journey is about to unfold. Final miracle. The ascension of Jesus. It was a moment unlike any other, as the risen Jesus stood with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. The scars on his hands and feet were a testimony to his sacrifice, but his presence was a living, breathing reminder of his victory over death. For 40 days since his resurrection, he had appeared to them, teaching, guiding, and preparing them for what was to come. Now, the time had come for him to leave. The disciples, filled with anticipation, asked him, "Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" Jesus gently redirected their focus. "It is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." Then, as they watched, something extraordinary happened. Jesus lifted his hands in blessing, and he began to ascend into the sky. Slowly, he rose higher and higher until a cloud enveloped him, and he disappeared from their sight. The disciples stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the heavens, their hearts a mixture of awe, wonder, and perhaps a tinge of sadness. Suddenly, 2 men dressed in white appeared beside them. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven." This final miracle wasn't just about Jesus leaving. It was about his promise to return. It was a moment of commissioning, a call to action. The disciples were no longer to simply follow. They were now to lead, empowered by the Holy Spirit to spread the message of his love and salvation to the world. How often do we look at life's challenges and feel unequipped, wondering how we can possibly carry out the work God has called us to do? The Ascension reminds us that we are never alone. Jesus promised his Spirit to guide, strengthen, and empower us for the mission ahead. This final act of Jesus' earthly ministry is a declaration of his sovereignty and a reminder of his unshakable promise. He will come again. Until that day, we are called to live as his witnesses, bringing his light and love to every corner of the world. As we reflect on these 37 miracles, let them serve as reminders of Jesus' divine power, boundless compassion, and the transformative hope he brings. Each miracle reveals his heart for humanity and his desire to draw us closer to him. The journey doesn't end here. It continues in the lives of all who believe. As we come to the conclusion of this journey through the 37 miracles of Jesus, it's impossible not to feel the depth of his love and the unmatched power of God. Each miracle we explored carries a clear message. Jesus doesn't just change circumstances, he transforms lives entirely. He is not distant, he is present, ready to step into our stories, face our challenges, and offer a hope that surpasses all understanding. Perhaps you started this video with a heavy heart, weighed down by doubts or struggles that feel insurmountable. But now, you've seen that Jesus can bring healing, restoration, and purpose, no matter how deep the pain or how dark the night. He calms storms, not just around us, but also within us. He restores sight to the blind and helps us see the way forward when we feel lost. He is the answer to our hardest questions, the comfort for our deepest pain, and the light that never fades. If there's one thing we've learned from these miracles, it's that Jesus always responds to faith, even when it feels small. He doesn't ask for perfection, only a heart willing to trust and take the next step. Maybe today, that step is opening your heart to him, trusting him in areas of your life where you've been carrying the burden alone. Or perhaps it's simply taking a moment to thank him for everything he's already done, acknowledging that every blessing is a reflection of his love for you. Now, I want to invite you to take a simple but meaningful action. If this message touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. It may seem like a small act, but it has a huge impact. By subscribing, you help us spread this message to more people who may be on the edge, desperately needing a ray of hope. Every new subscriber is another opportunity to reach someone who needs to hear about the love and power of Jesus. And there's something even more special. When you keep watching the videos that appear on your screen, you allow these truths to continue working in your heart. Maybe today, you've learned something new about Jesus' miracles, but there's always more to discover. This is only the beginning. Each video is an invitation to deepen your faith, to learn more about God's plan for your life, and to find strength in moments of difficulty. I also want to encourage you to leave a comment. Write, "Jesus is my miracle." This phrase is more than a declaration, it's an act of faith. By writing it, you're reaffirming your trust in him, declaring that he is still working miracles today in your life and the lives of those you love. And who knows, your comment could inspire someone else to take a step of faith too. Jesus taught us that our mission is to share his message with the world, and that's exactly what we're doing here. Every like, every comment, and every subscription is like planting a seed, spreading hope, and bringing life to hearts that may be tired or discouraged. So, I invite you, be part of this mission. Together, we can do something extraordinary. Remember, the same Jesus who turned water into wine, who healed the paralytic, and who raised Lazarus is alive today, and he sees you. He knows your heart, hears your prayers, and is ready to move in your life in ways you can't even imagine. Nothing is beyond his reach, and no situation is too great for his power. As you reflect on everything you've seen and heard, I want to remind you that new videos are waiting for you, filled with teachings that will continue to strengthen your faith and renew your hope. Jesus has so much more to show you, and every moment you spend with him is an investment in your spiritual journey. So now is the time. Subscribe, leave a comment, keep watching, and let these messages become a part of your life. Because when we connect with Jesus and share what we've learned, we're not just being transformed, we're helping to transform the world around us. Jesus is our miracle today and always. and he still has so much more to reveal to you. May God's peace, love, and grace be with you as you walk with him, and I'll see you in the next videos.